The squeak of the rubber wheels was the first sound to break the cold silence of the long hallway. It was a familiar sound, a rhythm that the old woman had known for 15 years. Her cart, her constant companion, rattled slightly with every push, its bottles and brushes and cloths a jumble of tools for her trade. The air in the Grand Music Conservatory was always cool in the morning, carrying the faint, clean scent of floor wax and the dust of old velvet curtains. It was her world, a world of polished wood and echoing spaces, and for the first few hours of the day, it belonged only to her. She started at the far end of the west wing, her routine as set as the sun. She moved with a slow, steady gait, her back aching a familiar protest. At 68, her bones felt like weathered wood, but her hands, though wrinkled and spotted with age, still moved with a certain grace. She took her spray bottle and a clean rag and began to wipe down the large windows that looked out onto the sleepy city. As she worked, the sun began to rise, casting long, golden fingers of light across the polished floors, making the dust motes dance like tiny, silent spirits. She watched the city wake up, cars beginning to move like ants on distant streets, and she felt a sense of peace. This quiet time was hers. Around 8 o'clock the building began to stir. The quiet was slowly chipped away by the arrival of its real inhabitants, the students. They would burst through the heavy doors, a flood of youthful energy, scarves flying, instrument cases slung over their shoulders. They carried the smell of coffee and fresh air with them, and their voices, full of excited chatter and nervous energy, filled the spaces she had just quieted. And just like that, she would begin to fade. It was a strange thing, being invisible. It wasn't that they were mean, not really. It was that she was simply not there. She was part of the furniture, like the chairs or the music stands. A young man with a cello case would rush past her, so close his coat almost brushed hers, but his eyes were fixed on some distant point, his mind already on a difficult passage of music. He wouldn't see her, wouldn't nod, wouldn't even register her presence. A group of girls would be laughing in the hallway, their conversation stopping for a brief second as she passed with her cart, then starting up again just as quickly, a little quieter, as if she were a temporary, unpleasant draft. She didn't mind, mostly. It made her work easier. She could move through their world, cleaning up their messes, polishing the surfaces they touched, without ever interrupting the flow of their important lives. She would empty the trash cans, finding crumpled up sheets of music, covered in frustrated pencil marks and empty coffee cups. She was the silent custodian of their dreams, but she listened. Oh, she listened. Her cart would pause outside a heavy oak door, and her hand, holding a rag, would stop mid-wipe. Behind the door, a piano would be playing. The notes would come fast and furious, a torrent of sound that was technically brilliant. Every note was perfect, every scale a blur of speed. She would close her eyes for a moment, her head cocked to the side. She could hear the precision, the thousands of hours of practice, the sheer talent. But she couldn't feel the music. It was like looking at a beautifully painted picture of a fire. You could see the shapes and the colors, but you couldn't feel the warmth. Too fast. She would whisper to the empty hallway. "You're running away from it." She remembered her own teacher, a stern man with a thick accent from a lifetime ago. "The notes are just letters," he used to say, tapping her knuckles with a ruler when she made a mistake. "You must make them into words. You must tell a story." She had understood then. She had lived inside the music. Another time, she was cleaning the glass of a practice room door. Inside, a young woman was wrestling with a violin. The girl's face was scrunched up in concentration, her brow furrowed. She played the same 3 bars over and over, each time a little sharper, a little more frustrated. Finally, she let out a loud groan and slumped over the instrument. The old woman felt a pang of sympathy, so sharp it was almost a pain. She knew that feeling. She knew the desperate, aching gap between what your hands could do and what your soul heard. She remembered being that young, feeling that same frustration, sitting in a small, dusty room with a piano that had yellowing keys. The memory was so vivid she could almost smell the old wood and feel the cool ivory under her fingertips. She never lingered too long. She would move on, pushing her squeaking cart down the hall, leaving the student to their struggle. Her work was physical. It was about scrubbing and wiping and polishing. It was about turning chaos into order. It was a world away from the abstract, emotional world of creating music. Or so she told herself. But as she worked, the melodies would follow her, weaving themselves into the rhythm of her day. A frantic violin piece would accompany her as she scrubbed a bathroom floor. A soaring piano sonata would be the soundtrack to her cleaning the great hall. She knew the pieces better than the students did, sometimes. She knew where they would stumble, where they would rush, where they would lose their way. Her shift would end as the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the floors. The students would leave, tired but still buzzing, heading out to dinners or to more practice in their own apartments. The building would slowly fall silent again, and she would do her final rounds. This was her favorite time. She would walk through the empty hallways, her cart now light, her work done. She would pass the darkened practice rooms, the silent instruments waiting inside like sleeping animals. Sometimes she would stop at the door of the main concert hall. It was always unlocked. She would push it open and step inside. The hall was vast and dark, except for the single ghost light on the stage casting a lonely, ethereal glow. And there, in the center of the stage, sat the grand piano. It was the king of this domain, sleek and black and magnificent. It was always covered with a thick, protective cloth. She would walk slowly down the aisle, her footsteps the only sound. She would climb the 3 steps to the stage and stand before the covered piano. She would never touch it, never play it, but she would stand there for a long time, just looking at the shape under the cloth. She would think about all the music it had made, all the hands, famous and unknown, that had danced across its keys. And she would feel a deep, quiet ache in her chest, a longing for something that felt so close and yet impossibly far away. Like a song she used to know but can no longer remember the words to. Then she would turn, walk away, and switch off the ghost light, plunging the hall into darkness, leaving the king to sleep until the next day. The day began to wane, and the long golden light of late afternoon slanted through the tall, arched windows of the main concert hall. This was the heart of the conservatory, a vast, sacred space where sound bloomed and died like flowers. For most of the day it was empty, save for the single ghost light that stood on the stage, a silent sentinel. But now it was filled with the wary energy of students who had been practicing since dawn. A small group had claimed the hall, sprawling on the plush velvet seats of the front row. Their instrument cases lay open like treasure chests, and the air was thick with the scent of rosin, old wood, and the bitter dregs of coffee from paper cups. At the center of the group was a young man, a pianist whose name was spoken with a mixture of awe and resentment in the hallways. He was at the grand piano, his back ramrod straight, his face a mask of intense concentration. He was wrestling with a piece of music, a ferocious and complicated etude by Liszt that was a whirlwind of sound. His fingers flew across the keys, a blur of motion, striking the notes with a precision that was breathtaking. He was technically perfect, every note in its place, every scale a cascading waterfall of sound. But it was all surface. It was like watching a beautifully crafted machine perform its function. There was power, but no passion. There was speed, but no soul. He finished the final, thundering chord, and the sound crashed through the hall and then vanished, leaving a heavy silence. He slammed his hands down on the keys in frustration, the discordant clang echoing his anger. "It's no good," he said, his voice tight with irritation. "It's just noise. 1,000,000 notes a minute, and it means nothing." He ran a hand through his hair, messing up its perfect styling. "This piece is supposed to be a storm, a tempest of the heart. All I'm making is a racket." One of his friends, a dark-haired girl who played the violin, stretched her legs out in front of her. "Maybe you're trying too hard," she offered, her voice lazy. "You're thinking so much about the notes that you're forgetting to listen to them." "Easy for you to say," another boy chimed in, a lanky cellist who was picking at a loose thread on his jeans. "Your instrument actually sings." "This thing," he said, gesturing to the piano, "is just a hammer and a bunch of strings. It's a fight." The pianist scowled. It's not the piano? It's me. I'm missing something. The story. Liszt wasn't just showing off, he was feeling something. What was he feeling? I can't find it. He started the piece again, this time slower, trying to coax the emotion from the keys, but it still felt hollow, like a beautiful but empty shell dot as they talked. A familiar, quiet presence moved at the very back of the hall. The old woman was there, with her cart of cleaning supplies. She moved slowly, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. She had a large feather duster in her hand, and she was meticulously wiping down the carved wooden backs of the last row of seats, working her way forward. The students were so engrossed in their conversation and their frustration that they didn't notice her at first. She was just part of the landscape, the background to their important lives. She listened to the pianist's struggle, and her heart ached with a familiar old pain. She knew this piece. She knew it not just in her head, but in her bones. She could feel the longing in the quiet passages, the desperation in the frantic crescendos. She knew the story the young man was searching for because she had lived it. She saw his hands so strong and capable, flying over the keys, and she thought of her own hands, now wrinkled and worn, but once they had known that same dance. The pianist gave up again with a groan of frustration, letting his hands fall into his lap. I give up. I'm done for the day. My brain is fried. The violinist laughed. Let's get some food then. I'm starving. As they gathered their things, the cellist's eyes fell on the old woman at the back of the hall. He nudged the pianist and nodded his head in her direction. Hey, look. It's the ghost of the conservatory. They all turned to look. She was bent over a seat, her gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, her focus entirely on her work. She seemed completely unaware of them. I swear, that woman is everywhere, the violinist said, a smirk playing on her lips. She's like a ninja. 1 minute she's not there, the next minute she's dusting your shoulder. The pianist, still in a foul mood, scoffed. She probably thinks Liszt is a type of German sausage. The group laughed, a cruel, easy laugh that came from a place of privilege and thoughtlessness. It was a joke made at the expense of someone they considered invisible, someone who didn't matter in their world of high art and ambition. The cellist, emboldened by the laughter, leaned forward and said in a loud, mocking voice, "Hey, I bet you could play it better than him. Why don't you come down here and show us how it's done?" The old woman froze. Her hand, holding the feather duster, stopped in mid-air. The laughter died down as they saw her stillness. Slowly, she straightened up, her back making a soft cracking sound. She turned to face them, her face a neutral mask, but her eyes held a deep, unsettling calm. The pianist, his pride stung and his anger needing a target, sneered at her. "Yeah, come on. You think it's so easy? You think you can just feel the music? Be my guest." He stood up from the piano bench and gestured to it with a grand, sarcastic bow. "The stage is yours." His friends watched, a mix of shock and amusement on their faces. This was better than dinner. This was a show. They expected her to just shake her head and go back to her work, to mumble an apology and disappear into the shadows, but she didn't. She looked at the young man, her gaze unwavering. Then she placed her feather duster carefully on top of her cart. She took a small step forward, then another. She began to walk down the long aisle towards the stage. Her steps were slow, deliberate, and strangely heavy. The soft thud of her simple shoes on the carpet was the only sound in the vast hall. The students' smiles faded, replaced by a confused silence. They looked at each other, their expressions shifting from mockery to bewilderment. Was she actually doing this? As she walked, she seemed to change. The stoop in her shoulders straightened just a little. The tired and visible cleaner seemed to shed her skin with every step. She was no longer a background figure. She was the focus of the entire room. The students watched, mesmerized, as this small, elderly woman in a worn uniform moved towards the king of instruments, the grand piano. She reached the stage, and without a moment's hesitation, she ascended the 3 small steps. She walked across the polished wooden floor and stood before the bench. She ran a hand over its smooth, dark wood, a gesture of familiarity and respect. Then she sat down. The bench was huge, and her small frame made her seem almost childlike. She adjusted the bench slightly, her movements economical and precise. She placed her age-spotted, work-worn hands on the keys, her fingers hovering for a moment like a bird about to take flight. The hall was utterly silent. The students held their breath. They were no longer laughing. They were waiting, and none of them, not even the arrogant pianist, had any idea what was about to happen. The silence in the concert hall was a living thing. It was thick and heavy, pressing down on the small group of students scattered in the front row. They were no longer a group of arrogant, tired musicians. They were an audience, and they were holding a collective breath without even realizing it. On the stage, under the lonely glow of the ghostlight, the old woman sat perfectly still. Her small, stooped frame seemed out of place on the vast, polished stage, but her stillness gave her a presence that filled the entire room. The young pianist who had challenged her stood off to the side, his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of impatience and a dawning, unwelcome curiosity. For a long moment she did nothing. She simply sat, her hands resting on the keys, her eyes closed. It was as if she was listening to something far away, something only she could hear. The students exchanged uneasy glances. The cellist opened his mouth to say something, to break the strange tension, but the violinist next to him put a hand on his arm, shaking her head almost imperceptibly. Something was happening. They didn't know what, but they could feel it. Then her fingers moved. The first notes were not loud. They were soft, almost hesitant, like a question being asked in a dark room. They were the same opening bars the young pianist had played, but they were completely different. His had been sharp, precise, a statement of technical skill. Hers were filled with a gentle, searching quality. Each note was given space to breathe, to hang in the air for a moment before the next one arrived. It was like watching someone trace the outline of a memory with a trembling finger. The young pianist felt a strange prickle on the back of his neck. He knew these notes. He had played them 100 times. But he had never heard them like this. He had always approached them as a challenge, a mountain to be climbed. She was approaching them like a conversation. The music began to grow. The gentle questioning turned into a more confident statement than a dialogue. Her right hand began to weave a complex melody, while her left hand provided a foundation that was both strong and tender. The students leaned forward, their bodies drawn toward the stage as if by an invisible string. The mocking smirks were long gone, replaced by expressions of rapt attention. The cellist's mouth was slightly agape. The violinist had her hands clasped in her lap, her knuckles white. The pianist felt a knot form in his stomach. He was listening to the same piece of music, but it was as if someone had taken a black and white photograph and filled it with vibrant, impossible colors. He was hearing layers in the music he never knew existed. There was a deep, aching sadness in the minor passages, a longing so profound it made his own chest hurt. He had played those passages with technical accuracy, hitting all the right notes at the right time. But he had been reading the words. She was telling the story. The music swelled, growing in complexity and speed. This was the part he had struggled with, the whirlwind of notes that he could only play with furious concentration. Her fingers, though wrinkled and spotted with age, moved with an economy of motion that was breathtaking. There was no wasted energy, no frantic struggle. Her hands seemed to know exactly where to go, as if they were following a path they had walked 1,000 times. It wasn't just skill. It was memory. It was muscle memory etched into her very being over a lifetime. He watched her hands. They were not the hands of a pianist. They were the hands of a woman who had scrubbed floors, who had washed countless dishes, who had worked with her body for 60 years. The knuckles were swollen, the skin was thin, but on the keys they were transformed. They became instruments of pure expression. He saw a faint tremor in one of her fingers, a tremor that might have been from age or from the sheer force of the emotion she was pouring into the music. But the tremor didn't break the flow. It added to it. It was the quaver of a human voice holding back tears. The storm of the Liszt etude broke over the hall. It was no longer a racket, as he had called it. It was a tempest of the soul. It was the sound of joy and grief colliding, of love and loss dancing a frantic, beautiful dance. The sound filled every corner of the vast space, vibrating in the polished wood, in the velvet seats, in the very bones of the students who sat frozen in their seats. The cellist, a tough, sarcastic young man who rarely showed emotion, felt a hot tear slide down his cheek and quickly wiped it away, looking around to see if anyone had noticed. He saw the violinist, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking silently. The young pianist could not move. He was rooted to the spot, his mind reeling. He saw his entire life of practice, his awards, his praise from teachers, all of it, and it felt hollow. He had been a gymnast, showing off his strength and agility. He was watching an artist, painting with sound. He understood now what his own teacher had tried to tell him for years, what he had been too arrogant to hear. "You have the fingers," his teacher had said, "but where is your heart?" He had thought it was a silly, sentimental question. Now, listening to the old woman, he finally understood. His heart had never been in the music. He had only ever been interested in what his hands could do. The music began to quiet. The storm passed, leaving behind a sense of profound peace. The final notes were as soft as the first ones, a gentle answer to the initial question. They faded into the silence, one by one, until there was nothing left. The final note hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, a tiny, shimmering bubble of sound, and then it was gone. The silence that followed was deeper and more profound than the one before. It was a sacred silence, the kind that comes after a shared, powerful experience. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, staring at the small figure on the stage. The old woman opened her eyes. For a moment she looked lost, as if she had just woken from a long, vivid dream. The intensity in her face faded, replaced by the familiar, tired look she always wore. She looked down at her hands resting on the keys as if surprised to see them there. Then, gently, she lifted them off and placed them in her lap. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Without a word to the stunned students, she slid off the piano bench. She stood up, her back once again slightly stooped, the brief moment of regal posture gone. She smoothed down her worn uniform. Then she turned and walked slowly back down the 3 steps from the stage. She walked up the long aisle, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the carpet. She didn't look at the students. She didn't acknowledge their presence at all. She simply walked back to her cart, picked up her feather duster, and went back to wiping down the last row of seats, as if nothing had happened, but everything had happened. The students sat in silence, the music still echoing in their minds and hearts. The young pianist finally sank into a chair, his face in his hands. He felt a sense of shame so deep it burned, but underneath it something else was stirring. A new feeling, a new understanding. He looked at his own hands, the hands he had been so proud of, and for the first time, he saw them not as tools for perfection, but as instruments waiting to tell a story. The silence that filled the concert hall was not empty. It was full. It was heavy with the echoes of the music that had just died away, and it was thick with the unspoken thoughts of the small group of students who remained frozen in their seats. They were statues in a museum of someone else's memory. The young pianist stood near the stage, his arms hanging limply at his sides. He felt as if his entire understanding of music, of his own talent, had been a house of cards, and this old woman had just breathed on it. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders, making it hard to breathe. The cellist was the first to move. He slowly got up from his seat and walked a few steps down the aisle, as if drawn by a force he couldn't resist. He stopped, looking up at the stage where the old woman was now standing, her back to them, wiping down the music stand with a soft cloth. She had returned to her work, her movements slow and methodical, as if she had not just torn their world apart and rebuilt it. With a few notes on a piano, the cellist's voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible in the vast space. "Wait." The old woman's hand stopped moving. She didn't turn around. The violinist joined the cellist in the aisle, her face pale and her eyes wide. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. Who are you?" The young pianist flinched at the question. It was the question he should have asked, the question that mattered more than any technical challenge or any piece of music. He had seen her as a prop, a joke. He had never seen her as a person. Slowly, the old woman turned. Her face was tired, the lines around her eyes and mouth etched deep by a life of hard work. But her eyes were clear. They looked at the three students gathered at the foot of the stage, not with anger or pride, but with a strange, quiet sadness. She finished wiping the stand, placed the cloth neatly on her cart, and then walked to the edge of the stage. She sat down, her legs dangling over the side like a child telling a secret. "I was a girl once," she began, her voice soft and raspy, like the sound of dry leaves skittering across pavement. "In a small village very far from here. We had very little, but we had a piano. It was old, and some of the keys were chipped, and it was always a little out of tune. But to me it was the most beautiful thing in the world." She smiled faintly, a memory dancing in her eyes. "I would play for hours. My mother would worry that I would make my fingers bleed. My father would say I was chasing a ghost. But I wasn't. I was chasing a feeling. The feeling of making something beautiful out of silence." The students moved closer, sitting down on the carpeted floor of the aisle, looking up at her like children listening to a bedtime story. The young pianist remained standing, but he felt his legs go weak. "I was good," she continued, her gaze distant. "Good enough that people noticed. A teacher from the big city came to our village. He heard me play. He told my parents I had a gift. He arranged for me to audition for the National Conservatory." She paused, taking a breath. "I was 16. I had never been on a train. I had never seen a building with more than 2 floors. When I walked into the conservatory, it was like walking into a palace. The hallway smelled of wood and dust, just like this one. And there were pianos everywhere. Big, beautiful, black pianos, all of them waiting. I thought I had died and gone to heaven." She looked around the hall, her eyes taking in the velvet seats, the high ceilings, the stage where she had just played. It was the same. "This place is the same as the one I knew. A different world, but the same dream. What happened?" the violinist asked, her voice barely a whisper. The old woman's smile faded. "Life happened," she said simply. "The world changed. There was a revolution. Shouting in the streets. Fear in every home. My parents, they had saved all their lives for my education. The bank where their money was, it was gone. Everything was gone." She looked down at her hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "Suddenly, my dream was a luxury we could not afford. My scholarship was for the tuition, but we had nothing left for food, for a place to live. My brother was sick. My parents were old. There was no choice." The young pianist felt a lump form in his throat. He had complained about his teachers, about the pressure of competitions, about a difficult passage in a piece of music. He had never once had to worry about where his next meal was coming from, or whether his family would survive. "We left," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We came here. To this country. We had nothing. I had to work. 2 jobs, sometimes 3. Cleaning houses, washing dishes in restaurants. My hands, which knew the feel of ivory, learned the feel of a scrub brush. My back, which was straight for the piano, became bent from mopping floors." She flexed her fingers, a small, painful gesture. "There was no time for music. There was no room for it. Music was a memory, and for a long time it was a painful one. It was a ghost that reminded me of everything I had lost." She fell silent. The only sound was the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system. The students were completely still, mesmerized by the story. It was a story they could only imagine, a world away from their protected lives of art and ambition. "I got married," she said after a while. "I had children. I raised them. I worked. The years went by. The dream of the girl in the small village became a story I told myself sometimes, late at night. The piano became something I saw in movies, something I heard from an open window as I walked down the street. I told myself it was okay, that I had a good life. And I did, but there was always a part of me that was asleep. She looked directly at the young pianist, and her gaze was not accusatory, but kind. It has been over 40 years since I played on a real piano like that. 40 years. My hands are not what they used to be. My back aches all the time. But the music was still there, sleeping inside me. The young pianist finally sank to the floor, his back against a chair. He couldn't look at her. He looked at his own hands, resting on his knees. They were strong, fast, and technically perfect. But they were empty. They had never scrubbed a floor to feed his family. They had never held a sick child's hand through a long night. They had never known sacrifice. They had never known a real story to tell. He finally understood. The music wasn't in the fingers. It was in the life. And this woman, this invisible cleaning lady, had lived more life and felt more music than he ever could. She wasn't just a musician who had fallen on hard times. She was a living testament to the power of a dream, even a dream that had been put to sleep for 40 years. And in that moment, he didn't just respect her, he revered her. The story the old woman told hung in the air of the concert hall, as real and as tangible as the scent of old wood and dust. The students on the floor remained silent long after she had finished speaking. There was nothing left to say. Words felt clumsy and useless in the face of such a life. The young pianist stared at his own hands, no longer seeing them as instruments of precision, but as tools that had never been truly tested, never been forged in the fires of real life. He felt a profound sense of humility, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost painful. Finally, the old woman slid off the edge of the stage. Her feet made a soft thud on the carpet. She gave the students a small, tired nod, as if to say the conversation was over. She walked back to her cart, picked up a fresh cleaning cloth, and went back to her work, wiping down the armrests of the seats she had just told her life story to. The signal was clear. The moment had passed. It was time for the world to turn back to normal, but it couldn't. For the students, normal was a place they could no longer find. They left the concert hall in a daze, walking not as a group, but as individuals lost in their own thoughts. They didn't speak to each other. There was nothing to say. They just moved through the quiet hallways of the conservatory, their footsteps echoing in a building that suddenly felt different, older, and much more sacred. The violinist went to an empty practice room, but instead of picking up her instrument, she just sat in the dark, the old woman's story replaying in her mind. The cellist went to the cafeteria, bought a coffee he didn't want, and just stared out the window, seeing the bustling city but not really looking at it. The young pianist went back to his own practice room. He closed the door and sat at his piano. He looked at the sheet music for the Liszt etude, the notes that had been the source of so much frustration just an hour ago. Now they looked like a foreign language. He placed his hands on the keys, but he couldn't bring himself to play. Every note he thought of playing was now measured against the music he had just heard. It would be like trying to paint a sunset with a gray crayon. He felt a deep, hollow ache in his chest. He had spent his life trying to be perfect. He had just met someone who was perfectly real, and he realized he didn't know the first thing about it. The story, of course, could not be contained. It was too powerful, too unexpected. It leaked out of the concert hall like a strange, beautiful melody. The cellist, unable to keep it to himself, told a friend in hushed, reverent tones. The violinist wrote about it in a text message to her mother, trying and failing to capture the magic of the moment. Soon, whispers were traveling through the conservatory. "Did you hear about the cleaning lady? She played the Liszt etude. They say it was the most beautiful thing they've ever heard. They say she was a prodigy." The whispers reached the office of the director of the conservatory. He was a man in his late 50s, with a neat gray beard and a perpetually worried expression. He was a pragmatist, a man who dealt in budgets, enrollment numbers, and faculty meetings. He had heard countless stories about brilliant students over the years, and they all tended to sound the same. This one sounded like a tall tale, a piece of folklore created by tired, overly dramatic students, but the story didn't go away. It grew. A student who had been in the hall had managed to record the last few minutes of the performance on his phone. The audio quality was poor, full of the shuffling sounds of the person recording, but the music was there. It was undeniable. Someone sent the file to the director. He listened to it in his quiet office. Late one evening, with the window open to the sounds of the city, he expected to hear an amateurish but heartfelt performance. What he heard made him stop what he was doing. He closed his eyes. He listened to the phrasing, the touch, the impossible depth of emotion coming through the tiny speaker of his phone. It was not the playing of a hobbyist. It was the playing of a master. A master who had not played in 40 years. He felt a shiver go down his spine. He listened to the recording 3 more times. Then he knew he had to find this woman. He found her the next morning, in the west wing, polishing the large windows that looked out onto the city. She was moving slowly, her cloth making soft circles on the glass. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. She looked exactly like what she was, an elderly woman doing a physically demanding job. There was no aura of greatness about her, no hint of the magic she held inside. "Excuse me," he said. She turned, her eyes a little wary, expecting a complaint or a new, difficult task. "I'm the director of the conservatory," he said, his voice gentle. "May I talk to you for a moment?" She nodded, her hands clutching her cleaning cloth. "I've heard a story about you," he began, feeling a little awkward. "And I've heard a recording. I don't really know what to say, except that I am deeply moved, and deeply ashamed that we have had such a treasure in our midst for so long and never knew it." The old woman just looked at him, her face unreadable. She was used to being ignored. This sudden attention was unsettling. "I would like to offer you something," the director continued. "It's not a teaching position. I wouldn't insult you by asking you to teach technique. But our students, they are brilliant. They are technically flawless, but many of them, they have forgotten why they started playing. They have forgotten the story. We need someone to remind them." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We would like to offer you a new position. We would call it Artist in Residence for Musicality. The job would be simple. You would have your own small key to the building. You could come and go as you please. You could sit in on rehearsals. You could listen to students practice. If you felt moved to, you could talk to them. Not as a teacher, but as a witness. As someone who knows the true cost of music. We would, of course, pay you a proper salary. You wouldn't have to clean anymore unless you wanted to." The old woman stared at him. She thought about her aching back, her tired hands, the endless cycle of scrubbing and polishing. She thought about the dusty piano in her small apartment, the one she hadn't touched in years. She thought about the feeling of her hands on the keys of the grand piano, the music waking up inside her after a long sleep. "I don't know if I have anything to teach them," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You have everything to teach them," the director said softly, a week later. The young pianist was practicing in a small, sunlit practice room. He was not playing the Liszt Etude. He was playing a simple Mozart sonata. He was playing slowly, carefully, his focus not on the notes, but on the space between them. The door opened quietly, and the old woman stepped inside. She was not in her cleaning uniform. She was wearing a simple cardigan and a skirt. She carried a small mug of tea. She didn't say anything. She just sat in a chair in the corner of the room and sipped her tea. Watching him dot, the young pianist felt a flicker of his old self, a surge of performance anxiety. He wanted to impress her, to show her he was worthy. He started to play faster, to add flourishes he thought were clever. He stopped. He looked over at her. She was just watching him, her expression calm. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a quiet, patient understanding. He took a deep breath and started again. This time, he didn't try to impress her. He just played. He thought about the story she had told him, about the girl in the small village, about the chipped keys on the old piano. He thought about sacrifice and love and the beauty of a simple melody. He played the sonata not as a technical exercise, but as a conversation. He put his own small young life into the notes. When he finished, he looked at her, his heart pounding. She had a single tear rolling down her cheek. She smiled at him, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "Now," she said softly, "that was a story." The young pianist smiled back, a real smile, one that reached his own eyes. The conservatory had a new ghost, but this one was no longer silent. She was its heart.